Aldous Huxley makes an interesting story about the narrative about the Western condition and the Western prosperity and West being on top that we don't really think about very clearly on a day-to-day basis. And this was a few decades ago now. And so armaments, we know about the notion of a military industrial complex. Universal debt, something I guess that we all take for granted these days. Planned obsolescence, that was much more of a concern in the mid-century of the mid-20th century as it is today, where the churn of material products has become much more dramatic but less commented upon. I think that the kind of narrative that is missing here completely is that what was the cost, either for the planet or for the rest of the world, of this Western prosperity that he's talking about? Because it's one of the very curious things about our situation is that the West has been rich because of its empires and because of its economy, but it hasn't got rich in abstract. It's got rich at the expense of the planet and the expense of the rest of the world. And our capacity to be blind to that reality that somebody has paid for our richness and our prosperity, yeah, it's one of the mysteries of the age that we're in. Nowadays, I think that that's what they talked about in the 20th century, it's more dramatic now, is that the logic of growth is something that we are expected to regard as axiomatic, as inevitable, whereas the engine of growth, the kind of biophysics of growth, is a combination of a perpetually expanding use of energy that is enabled by a perpetual expansion of debt. Those two things are part of a similar process that kind of keeps the whole global economy alive. And the fact that this is because of the laws of biophysics and just basic mathematics, it cannot go on. But yeah, that reality, the profound kind of inevitability of collapse, is kind of missing from the situation completely. And I think this is one of the causes of the very hard to understand anxiety that we all suffer from. So there's the anxiety of seeing hideous people on the television doing hideous things to nature, a whole series of reports from global organizations telling us how bad things are. At the end of the day, all of those narratives miss out on the debt energy kind of machine that's driving us over the cliff. And so I think that's why people sense that, but it's not spoken, one of the sources of our anxiety. This is very dated now, this notion that we have the right and some kind of moral duty to be kind to nature. I think that nowadays the sensibility is two very dramatically different conditions. One is nature is taking its revenge on us in a rather big way with climate change and various disruptions to our previously calm weather situation. And so being compassionate to nature when nature is getting so unstable and weird is, it seems a bit fanciful, romantic, and from the past. But the other thing is that more and more people are really realizing that we are not separate from nature in the sense that it's like a small creature that we have to be kind to. We are part of nature. And even the most kind of rationalistic and word-obsessed and abstraction-driven people are beginning to kind of absorb the fact that the situation of nature and the living system, we're part of that. And it's no longer makes any sense to say, okay, we must be kind to nature. We must be kind to ourselves in that sense. So it's a nice kind of, it's a marker of the way that the sensibility of the culture has changed, that this notion of being kind to nature, that doesn't ring at all modern for this moment. So it's interesting to read Daniel Defoe talking about enjoying just as much as we can use and no more. It's one of the early failures to persuade Western capitalistic people to survive on what they need rather than what they can have. And it's romantic and impractical in the context of the capitalist economy, because the capitalist economy exists in order to generate new needs, and it continues to expand on the basis of turning things that used to be free or commonly held into things that we have to pay for. So this notion of arguing for some form of restraint, the notion of, you know, an economy of basic needs, an economy of only meeting our practical requirements. It's a good example of where writing books and giving speeches or giving talks really doesn't achieve very much, and if the basic logic of the economy is untouched. It's not about moral choices or people deciding to be less wasteful, less greedy of resources. It's just, you know, that's not how our condition has evolved. I do think that the other quaint thing about Defoe is this notion that sobriety is some kind of lifestyle choice. I'm being a bit unkind here, but there is a lot of people of the kind of current generation who says we must choose to use less, we must choose to consume more modestly. That also leaves aside the kind of incredible cultural power of the need creating industry, which drives the consumption that is at the heart of capitalism. In other words, that if we could be satisfied with just enough, then the whole economy would grind to a halt and would collapse because it has to grow. And therefore that it's not just about material consumption that we can control or be critical about, it's also the sense of anxiety. And I think that's, somebody else said that, you know, the condition, the default state of mind under capitalism at this period is anxiety. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't have the capacity to predict and to plan and to be sure about our futures. And that is a big, big change from, you know, my lifetime, never mind the longer period, in which the expectation of progress has been pretty kind of solid until now. So you now have us rich northern people sharing the condition of uncertainty along with the rest of the world, which has had this uncertainty thanks to our rapacious behavior for generations. And we're now basically kind of all at the same situation. We're all in an emerging economy or an emerging culture. And we deserve it. We're absolutely paying the price for our activities over the last generations. But that's why it's not going to be enough at this moment to say, okay, we will choose to consume less. That isn't going to happen. It's not possible. We will consume less because we're poorer in money terms. That will take care of a lot of it. But we will also consume less, not because writers or philosophers tell us to do that, but because shared meeting of needs at a kind of collective basis will be the best way for us to survive and also prosper. So, yeah, I don't see the kind of discussion of how we can be more modest in our material expectations. Again, it's another cute feature of the past, but reality in physics and basic mathematics is going to cause our behavior to change much more effectively than a book, sadly, for us publishers. Well, because I was desperate to ask you about that documentary, because I made a complete fool of myself, because they said, please will you make a film? Did they do the same with you? Make a film of your daily life. And so by that time, and I've been living in a small country town for 19 years, so I was, so to speak, already here. And I'm not sure that they realized that. I thought they may have been having some kind of very stressful city existence. But I was confined by the French kind of regulations into 1 kilometer from my house. And so I made these films of me walking around with my dogs, looking at trees and plants and having a very kind of pastoral daily life, and commenting about the complete silence and the extraordinary, very amazing and magical atmosphere that there was here in the countryside, never mind the city. And then I sent these films in, and they kind of made this, thank you so much, marvelous, wonderful films, and not 100% sure we can use all of them, which they of course used none of them, because the final film itself was this incredible kind of Adam Nicholson type, kind of fast cut, urban, kind of gritty people, refugees, disasters and broken things, which with the best will in the world, my films weren't about that. So this was a good example of a slight misunderstanding. Either they misunderstood my situation or I completely misunderstood what they were asking me to do. But that's we were compelled by the regulations about not going more than 2 kilometers from the house at the hardcore of the confinement, as we call it here in France. And that shaped my behavior for weeks and months. And so it wasn't a choice at all. I was following rules. And I must say, it's been a very magical and amazing period, and it still is. So I personally don't feel the call of going back to where I was before. I mean, I was a absolute climate criminal. I've been traveling pretty intensely since I was 16 years old, all over the world for the first 2 decades on foot and overland, but the last 20, 30 years in planes all the time. So now it's been prohibited because of the COVID. And I think it's just somebody had to tell me to stop, because it's clearly, it's not excusable as a personal contribution to the kind of climate and so on. But I benefited personally by being forced to kind of understand and concentrate on where I am, look at your local place. And I've been living here for, longer than anywhere in my life. I've been living in this whole part of France. And now I've learned more about it in 1 year than in the previous 18 years, that's for sure. So I don't know what this means, to be honest, but it's about what I do not think that we will change or save the planet by having mental processes and choosing to live differently. I think circumstances and conditions need to change, which we can contribute. And that's a big part of my work, is to say you can change the conditions under which we're living, but that's not the same thing as giving people lectures about being good to nature. That's 2 separate things. So this is a good example of Thoreau being no doubt a very wise and virtuous man. I have no personal confidence in my skill at wanting for little. I just have, over the last period, had less at my disposal. I've been getting poorer in cash terms for the last 20 years. And like lots of other people and vast amounts of the population, one adapts to these changing circumstances. And my life has got better. It hasn't got worse in many, many, many ways. So I've been forced by circumstances to live with little, rather than being, an eminent writer who kind of says, well, yes, I should get by with less. It's what I was saying at the beginning, and about the crisis generally. We adapt so quickly to really very trying things. I'm not, I have no hardship compared to most people, but to live a simpler life with radically less mobility, radically less freedom, I suppose. I've adapted very quickly, and my family around me in the same way, I would say. So that in terms of the transition to something else, the problem is not going to be people making decisions to give up a rich way of life and choose a poor one. The problem is how you create the conditions where that transition kind of is natural and unavoidable. And so, which I think is what's happening now. I mean, not an original thought, but I just think that wanting little, we have less. That the people who had a lot of resources before have less now, radically less, just in a few months. And we then accustomed ourselves to that, and then we move on. So that's how change happens. I choose to believe that anyway. I have a theory of change, which is, again, not about personal choice, but it's what Ilya Prigogine is a physicist, one of the founders of systems thinking and science. And he said that when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence have the capacity to change the system. And so, as far as I'm concerned, my job and my life is to seek out small islands of coherence as examples of different ways of living as examples of people surviving on radically fewer resources than I have or people like me have, and not kind of being romantic or sentimental about it, but saying, here is somebody who gets food for their family, has somewhere to live, cares for their child, cares for their old parents, with 5% of the resources that people in the West expect to be needed. What can we learn from how that is? Have they done that often for a very long time? Or maybe these small islands of coherence are what people in inner cities do with less mobility, less money, but using phones and networks to organize things in different ways. So the reason I remain rather optimistic about the situation is that there are a lot of these small islands of coherence out there. And if one chooses to look, which I literally do choose to look for them, there's a lot to be found. So that's my starting point. And then for discussion, how do you connect them up together? How do you help them thrive or get bigger or multiply? That's the kind of the discussion. But the possibility of a better future is not something which I think comes out of your head or the writer's imagination or a utopian clique. The alternatives are there. They just have to be found and connected with. My practice is to look for people doing things in new ways that others describe in abstract. So take the example of food and the food systems. All my life, people have said it would be so great if we knew the farmers that grew our food rather than relying on what it says on the packet in the supermarket. I've been doing quite a lot of work in China where they have 230 million smallholder farmers. It is quite extraordinary to me the speed with which they're deploying very simple communication connections, basically phones, so that farmers can live stream stories about their life on the farm directly to people in the city. And one can have a relationship with the person who grew the mango, who grew the tea or whatever, which has been all my life a kind of fantastical idea that would be nice to imagine, but not realistic. In China, it's happening right now, and they expect by the end of 2020 that something like 250, 300,000 smallholder farmers will be live streaming as part of their daily life. So that's not even small islands, a very large number of small islands of coherence. Another one which I'm very preoccupied by is the question of caring for elders, and not just general care in this kind of when all so much fear and scaremongering in the media about COVID and the health systems collapsing. There are certain places in the world where care is provided by not civilians, but people like nurses or paramedics on a kind of in your house, in your community, which covers about 80 or 90% of the care that most people need. But they do this in the form of, self-managing cooperatives rather than people at the bottom of the feeding chain of essential workers. So in the north of Italy, it's incredible the number of, and also Quebec, big chunk of what in the rest of the world is a very problematic, social services or health services is provided by self-employed or people working in cooperatives, and it works brilliantly. And what I just do not understand, and I've asked quite a lot of people, why this very good example of a rather radically alternative way to do things cannot be replicated elsewhere. And I don't know what the answer to that is yet. But every time somebody says, "Oh my God, the health system is collapsing," I say, yeah, it probably is collapsing, but there are places in the world where care and health is completely organized in a different way, and we should learn from that. And I do learn from them, and I say, well, we should all go to Bologna and learn from how they do it in Bologna. But nobody does that because people are kind of stuck somehow curiously in the French situation or whichever country you're in. I think this is a great sentence it describes what I think is what pervades my thinking and experience of this period, is that our anxiety is not so much about materially terribly awful situation. If we end up in an ICU, intensive care unit, that is a terrible thing to happen. But most people are not having that experience. What we all have is the prospect of people saying things to us on the media or in the social media that are self-evidently not true, but that they say these things with great conviction because they are, if they're politicians, they don't know what else to do except to say, nonsensical things with great conviction. And it feels as if it's become more extreme. I mean, I don't envy somebody running a government trying to run a pandemic, but the fact their capacity to talk nonsense to us when we can experience that the reality is often, it seems to be more extreme. So the example in my own situation is last week, I've been following the discussions about the common agricultural policy in the European Parliament in Luxembourg, which is a rather dry and obscure subject, but it does actually, and I really rather strongly try not to get preoccupied by that sort of politics. But on this occasion, they're deciding how the money of Europe will be spent for the next 7 years in terms of the land, agriculture, biodiversity, and so on. And so I've observed my expert friends who do it as a profession. They've said, oh, it's going to be much better this time. We've spent 10 years preparing for a Green New Deal, and the Common Agricultural Policy will be transformed because it has to be aligned with the Green New Deal. That was like 10 days ago. And then last week, day by day, every single feature of the Common Agricultural Policy that could be like looking after the soil, looking after hedgerows, farming in ways that are friendly to nature, and so on. All of those things were turned more or less upside down, so that by the end of the week, you had, 500 MEPs, members of the parliament, voting electronically for something which was literally the opposite of what we all expected to be happening. And then the president of the commission goes on all the television and said, congratulations, we have now voted for a radically changed common agricultural policy, which is a friend to biodiversity and nature, is going to be much safer in our hands, which everybody knows is like just a direct lie. And you think, how can somebody at such a high level go on the television and in the newspapers and say to all of us something that she knows to be untrue? And the answer is, I don't know how they do that, but it's a very horrible, that's where the anxiety comes from. And so I retreat from my brief engagement with kind of traditional politics and say, hey, stop, go back to your small islands of coherence and get healthy again, and go and find people doing actual real things on a farm, restoring a forest or whatever. And that's where the real work is being done. Do not drive yourself mad listening to these insane people lying to you through their teeth about something which you know is just it's terrible. So this is where, what is he saying? Weber was saying the politician cannot be satisfied with merely intending to do the right thing. And yeah, I think that we all collectively have to, there are certain forces like, big capital and big money, big land, big farming, big agriculture. They're too big in that particular context to fight head on. We can't, at the moment, we can't do it. Therefore, don't fight losing battles. Go and amplify the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of small experiments, which are the alternative, which are happening now. So that's what I've been doing in the last 2 or 3 days since this horror of the European budget, is to go and talk to my friends who are farmers or make bread or look after old people and say, how's it going? Are things looking up a bit? And you get a mixed responses, but at least they're real people doing the real thing. John rules. So I'm not a jurist, obviously, but I know quite a few people who are becoming rather convinced that we need, as well as activism, as well as scientists saying what needs to be done to look after nature, as well as entrepreneurs inventing new ways of running businesses that aren't ecocidal. We do need a kind of legal framework because the world does seem to have a partial capacity and a reliance on legal systems. I mean, they get distorted and perverted, but I'm an outsider to the world of law, but it's something which clearly has tremendous traction in many fields of life. So the notion of a legal system that supports the rights of all life rather than just the rights of a few humans, let alone the rights of a few white male humans, I think it absolutely is a worthwhile enterprise. I'm not sure that Rawls was talking about. He was talking about a just society, the liberties of equal citizenship are taken as settled. That again is from the kind of great mid-century, mid-20th century Enlightenment view of the law leveling down in unequal distribution of power and economic success in society. We're way beyond that now because the economy itself is the source of destruction. We need to have a legal system which enshrines the rights of all life, not just human life, having co-equal rights to thrive. And that's what's happening. It's quite remarkable, really, how many different networks of lawyers and jurists are working on so-called natural law. I have no knowledge about how long it takes for these things to go through the system. And I'm sure it's true that law for nature or law for life cannot exist in isolation from political or cultural change. But the fact that there is a rather major sort of writing of draft laws for nature, I think is a rather positive sign that the kind of cultural change to enable that to happen is happening at the same time. So that's, gives me a lot of encouragement there. For some reason, people in South Africa are taking the lead in laws for the rights of nature, more so than in the US. Maybe that's not surprising now. But these curious kind of clusters of radical but very kind of knowledgeable law writers are doing amazing stuff. And that's coming. That's going to be benefiting from that quite soon, I think. I am not an expert on Socratic theories of society. I just come back to what I was saying about the legal situation, is that we are moving from, in my experience, a kind of rather spectator's view of nature as something you observe on the television as being very nice, and it's a kind of very sad that these animals are in trouble or that we're wiping out species, and that there's a kind of fairly, most of my life has been filled with a growing anxiety about the terrible state of nature. What I've said a bit earlier, and I'm learning as well from the wisdom traditions of indigenous cultures as from scientists, that we're all part of the same basket of living systems on this planet. So the notion that we are separate is no longer making sense either sort of philosophically or in terms of the science. Therefore, the kind of actions that we take in terms of having a society of agents, we are going to be coexisting in that society with all forms of living system and living creatures. And so it's kind of, 5 years ago, I met some people who were talking about slime molds, which are these like single cellular creatures. And they were saying, well, slime molds have the capacity to act collaboratively when they need to move from one place to another, when their nutritional kind of resources are depleted. Then the slime mold goes from one place to another. And I was just absolutely bewitched by that notion that something which was a living system of entities that didn't have brains like we're supposed to have could take this purposive action. I thought it was fantastic. And so I went to my publisher with my last book saying, I've got a great title, for my book. This was at Temps and Hudson, an English publisher. How to be a slime mold, because the notion of kind of thinking about the world in terms of top down, you know, white people telling the rest of the world what to do, or experts telling the rest of us, or powerful autocrats telling, you know, brutalizing, getting their will. That is the old way. The new way is that we all have to kind of share from each other an awareness of what needs to be done and move collectively en masse, which is kind of, it's not a very satisfactory theory of change, but it's kind of, it gives me comfort. But anyway, my publisher said, John, you and your 3 hippie friends might understand that title, but I don't, and we are a publishing company. We need a more serious title, so we ended up with a different one. But this notion of a society of beings, it is, I think it's pretty amazing how fast that is becoming broader and more, it's not controversial anymore. You know, one of the things that's happened during the lockdown is that people trapped in their homes or their apartments, they just look around, you examine things that are quite close to you. And the number of weed watching sites and people who examine, you know, kind of moss on the balcony of their apartment, they've grown incredibly. Just hundreds of people now document the kind of health of the weed that is on the window outside their apartment, but they've been sitting there for like months on end, not able to go out and be distracted by going somewhere else. And so the weed watching phenomenon, or the concrete botanist, is, yeah, it's kind of people, very unlikely people I'm finding are saying, yeah, we all seem to be in this together, me and my weeds. So I think it's, I don't want to exaggerate what it means, but, and you made the point that maybe all this will disappear when the pressure of the virus gets a bit less, but I don't see that happening very quickly, to be honest. Maybe 2 years of solid confinement will amplify in a very good way our connection to local living things in a way that being anything else would never have happened. I don't know, we shall see. Orwell is writing about reducing the scope of language so that one's experience is reduced by the contraction of language. I kind of understand what he was on about. But this indeed speaks to my rather strong feeling that we are not going to get out of trouble or into the next place by language alone anyway, and that whether or not language is being diminished, which is maybe true, that I do very strongly, and this is partly on my own experience, we need embodied experiences of these alternatives in order to have the kind of the opportunity to change and to move on. So when I can write an article, I can tell you about somebody making bread out of heritage grains in some small part of France, and you can say, well, that sounds quaint. If you have direct contact with that person, with the bread, with the atmosphere in the bakery, with the people who tell you about the field, if you maybe go and see the field, then you taste the bread. In other words, if you have embodied experiences, then it comes to life. You think, this is fantastic. This is what food should be like. All my food should be healthy. I should know who grew it or made it. I should know where the field is. I should be able to offer to help out and so on, which, by the way, is how food used to be until the last generation. But it's the feeling, it's the multi-sensory and the embodied experience of an all different reality. That small line of coherence, it's the embodied bit that is crucial. So although I am, I'm supposed to be a writer, I am a writer. I have increasing reality check on the power of words by themselves to change our situation. But what I use my words for is to say, by the way, if you go over there and look at this bakery, if you go to that river and see the people who are cleaning the riverbanks, or if you go to that cooperative in Italy and meet the people who are looking after elderly people as a co-op, then you will experience a different way of doing things. So in other words, I use my words as like a kind of map. And so go there, connect with people. Maybe you have to do it virtually, but not describing a better world. I've fallen out with some friends in the last year or two. This whole notion that we lack imagination. It's a very popular narrative. We need imagination. We need to be creative. I don't agree. I think we need to be curious about what's already there. It's often very close, and our curiosity should be based on a very precise expectation that there will be a lot of positive things happening not far away if we choose to look. And that, yes, there's a lot of shit happening, excuse my French, but also there's a lot of care happening, a lot of love happening, a lot of connection happening, good relationships happening all around us that we can be part of, and we can help them flourish if we just be a bit less hung up on sort of, the big picture or the narrative or the utopian sort of story. I don't think we need that. I think that there are as many terrible things happening, but they've been, with good and bad, they've been uncovered. So the distraction of movement, the distraction of having jobs and going to offices or traveling, they've all taken away. So we've had no distractions from saying, well, Bob, what's happening here and now? And you see both, actually. I can't tell you whether I'm just kind of delusional, but I choose to see a lot of positive things around me because I do see them. The people just looking after each other in very simple, practical ways. Unlikely people like me, appreciating plants and lichen and old trees and stuff. That's everywhere you see that, because we know it's not that we're suddenly enlightened. We have nothing else to do. We are not distracted from the other stuff. Plus, I think a lot of us are turning off the sources of stressful information, looking at the news and stuff. So that's a practical way of filtering out the bad stuff. But I haven't seen. Have you seen any good? Is there any data about how many people have just simply stopped watching the news? Or I have become quite expert at muting words on Twitter, because one of my default channels is Twitter. I've got rather a long list of things I just tweet, mute, delete, and then all those names and people disappear more or less. It's rather effective. Maybe I should become a Twitter mute coach and help people kind of remove the stress-inducing words. It's a very good idea.